Okay. In lieu of, we're going to go ahead with our finance committee, and we're just going to start with those items that do not require any action in anticipation of Director Melvin arriving, so we could do all of those fun things. So, and in light of the fact that our chair and vice chair are not here, Director Colson, also on the finance committee, is going to step up and run the show.
Okay, good morning. I call the meeting of the Finance Committee to order. I ask the Secretary to call the roll.
Director Anderson, Director Buchanan, Director Colson,
Here.
Director DeWitt,
Here.
Director Lewis,
Present.
Director Melvin, Director Troiani, Director McGallis. We have 4 present and 4 absent at this time. Let the record show that Directors Durante, Frega, Fuentes, Higgins, Hobson, Pang, and Ross are all also present.
All right, can we approve the minutes?
No, we can hold off until we see what happens.
All right, then the next item is the item 3A, the report on monthly financial results, January 2017. B?
Good morning. So today we'll review the financial results for January 2017. In general, favorable expense results have continued into 2017 and more than offset unfavorable operating revenue. A little bit about the area. The size of the Chicago area labor force decreased by about 7,000 in January. However, employment increased by about 1,400 jobs. This resulted in a decline in the regional unemployment rate to 5.7%, but it still lags the national employment rate by 0.9 percentage points. January system ridership was 0.9% lower than budget, as shown. Let's go to as shown by the orange bar. There we go. As shown by the orange bar on the chart, January ridership decreased by 2.7% versus prior year. Now let's look at each service board. Each service board except for Metro continues to see ridership results below budgeted levels. As indicated by the red boxes, Pace Suburban Service ridership was 8.6% unfavorable to budget, and ADA paratransit ridership was 5.9% unfavorable. For January 2017, the average price of gas was $2.57 per gallon, compared with $2.07 per gallon in January of 2016. So this was a 24.1% increase over the prior year. Although the futures market is forecasting fuel prices to start slowly rising, we are still well below the 5-year average of $3.29. Now let's look at operating revenue. So it was $1.5 million or 1.7% unfavorable to budget, primarily due to the unfavorable fare revenue, combined with the lower level of reduced fare reimbursement we're expecting to receive from the state for state fiscal year 2017. So we're budgeting it where we budgeted at the full amount, but now we're showing it here at 50%, which impacts mostly the CTA. So their operating revenue was 3.8% unfavorable, so that's highlighted in red, again due to the loss of the reduced fare reimbursement and compounded by lower than budgeted fare revenue results. Looking at Pace Suburban Service, operating revenue was 6.2% unfavorable, highlighted in red again, due to the shortfall again in the RFR, compounded by the lower than budgeted fare revenue. ADA paratransit revenue was 10.4% unfavorable, and most of this is due to the delays in Medicaid reimbursement, but also their fares their ridership is down. The public funding section of the dashboard shows unfavorable results to budget for each service board except ADA, which is funded at budget. We include here January sales tax at budget, but with actual PTF results from the month of October. For each service board, PTF results were unfavorable to budget by 4.8%, contributing to an unfavorable public funding variance of 1.5%. Now look at system-wide expenses here. They were $5.4 million or 2.4% favorable to budget. Each service board is reporting favorable results. The mild and almost no free winter has benefited each service board's expense performance. Let's look at fuel now. As we go into January, only 11% of the favorable variance is attributable to low fuel prices, as we are starting to see fuel savings level out. Fuel savings totaled 0.6 million for the system in January. Okay, now Metra. And they reported favorable expense results of 3.9% compared to budget, which is highlighted in light blue. This decrease was due primarily to administration regional services savings of 1.1 million, as well as operations and maintenance savings. Pace Suburban Service had an 8.1% favorable to budget expense performance, also highlighted in blue, due primarily administration savings of 1.1 million. When you look at ADA paratransit, they're 3.5% favorable expense performance, and that's just lower because of less purchased transportation services from the lower ridership. So at the regional level, favorable operating expenses more than offset the unfavorable operating revenue and public funding, producing a net result of 2.2 million favorable to budget. Metro and Pace Suburban Service each have favorable net result variances in excess of 3% due to good expense performance. Now let's look at recovery ratio. So the recovery ratio, the regional recovery ratio, is below 50% for the first month of the year, but this is normal for the winter months. We watch it, as you know, very closely, and it goes up throughout the year as the weather gets warmer. The uncertainty of the state reduced fare reimbursement is certainly impacting this, but favorable expense performance needs to continue throughout 2017 to counteract the potential loss of half of this reduced fare reimbursement funding. The fare recovery ratio of 33.5% includes, or the pure recovery ratio includes passenger fare revenue only. When you look at ancillary service board revenue, the recovery ratio increases to 38.6 for January, and that's labeled as all revenue in this table. In the on the right section, we show the statutory recovery ratio labeled with credits and compared to budget. This stood at 45.8 in January, or 0.4 percentage points favorable to budget, again primarily due to favorable expense reports with each service board. So we can conclude the expenses have started off well, while the operating revenue and ridership are below budgeted levels, and we'll continue to monitor it closely. Are there any questions? Yes, Director Lewis.
You covered this, but I want to understand. On PACE, their public funding numbers are down. Is that, you said, is that because of slowness in Medicaid reimbursement?
The ADA is slowness in Medicaid reimbursements. Sometimes we'll receive Medicaid reimbursements for the prior year. And so that's really more of a timing difference. They do come. On PACE Suburban Service, that is affected by the reduced fare reimbursement, and that's at half of what their normal amount is.
Okay. And then the ridership is also down a little bit. Are they taking any initiatives to try and get more efficiency in their ridership programs, or is that not yet been disclosed?
So we met with them just this week, actually, and we were talking a little bit about these projections. They're still projecting ridership growth in 2017 based on their new service on the bus on shoulder programs. It is adding service to an area that didn't have that service. We certainly talked to them at great length last year when they were doing these projections, and they still felt very strongly that they're going to be able to meet them. They're monitoring their routes very closely. They're looking at their cash fares especially, and to see exactly if they're in any way tracking ridership more thoroughly. So they are looking at routes, they're looking at regions, and we'll see what they come back with, but they really didn't have any further explanation. Thank you. Director.
I think you've talked about this before, but if there's a fare increase, does that automatically have a positive impact on the fare box recovery ratio, or is that offset by a decline in ridership?
The way the formula works is that both of those impact. So PACE would tell you, and some of the other service boards will tell you, that whenever they have a fare increase, and Metro projected a slight ridership decrease based on their fare increase, that will impact ridership. So while the fare increase certainly will bring in more revenue, the loss of ridership at times can offset that. It really depends on the service board at times, and how those fares are structured, you know. There's ways to structure them that maybe would reduce the impact, and all of that would have to be explored further.
Question?
I'm always concerned about the fare box recovery, and we know from the budgeting at the end of last year that we're very close to that threshold. Now we have a concern of reduced revenue coming in. I'm assuming that all the service boards have contingency plans to deal with this, but my fear is that we'll enact them too late. When are we going to start enacting those contingency plans to make sure that we meet the statutory fare box recovery?
Well, right now, as I said, there's seasonal variations in the recovery ratio, so we're okay. I agree with you. I mean, we have to watch it very closely. One of the things that we're doing, first of all, we got them all to go up on the recovery ratio. No small feat, because some of them had not gone up in some time. So they did all adjust it. And they are also keeping their expenses, so back to the formula, keeping their expenses down helps the recovery ratio tremendously. So that's good. The other thing that we're talking about, and the service boards are requesting that we pursue it, is some relief on the recovery ratio. Because the bottom line is, we've had, instead of 34 million, we're getting 17 million on the recovery ratio. So if there was ever a time to ask for relief on recovery ratio, this would be it. We're in this boat for this reason. We also encourage them to look at their fares. We do that every year, and it's a combination of all of those things. So we're going to continue to watch it, and we will know very quickly, if in fact, we're going to run into trouble with recovery ratio. But I do think as long as they continue to watch their expenses as they're doing, you see what's going on, we'll be okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Director DeWitt?
Just a quick question, is there any feedback or performance being presented by PACE on the new Jane Addams Bus on Shoulder program, whether it's taken off, whether it's dragging?
I don't have any information on that yet. Leanne, you may.
They've got one new rider. We will
December,
get that,
yeah.
and
We're just through the first quarter, so.
yeah, and they've, the highways, the route's been running, but the lane really just opened up and things like that. So it's still pretty early, but anecdotally, from a very casual rider who rides a couple of times a week, it
Sure.
looks pretty good.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Director Ross?
On PACE ADA ridership, could that also be a positive number? Could that mean that people are taking fixed route transportation?
I can't, assume that. The fact is, when there's less ridership on there, it saves the region money. We know that. But I can't speak to. Certainly, there's very robust programs. There are other people here that would be better able to speak to that, but I can't say that that's directly attributable. I don't know.
We don't know. I mean, of course, we've been running our travel training program for several years, and that really helps a lot of ADA customers learn how to use the fixed route system if they're able. But there's really not a lot of robust data on that in terms of how to track, the movement from fixed route to, from ADA paratransit to fixed route. So that's something that is going to take time to figure out how to track that information.
So then what's the correlation between the decrease in ridership for ADA and the decrease in operating revenue? Can we assume that anything above 5.9% is attributable to Medicaid reimbursements?
We can look at that breakout. If you remember, sometimes all of a sudden we get this huge Medicaid and reimbursement, and then that totally throws off, right? And it looks good for a couple of months. Let's get you that breakdown. We can find out what Medicaid owes us and at least pull that out. And I can't say what I attribute the rest of it to, reduce, but we can tell you what Medicaid owes us, and we can check that with PACE.
Okay, thank you.
Director Lewis.
Michael, maybe you know the answer to this question. Lee and I talked about it a little bit. Is there a transit tracker phenomenon that PACE is contemplating where at the various stops there might be information about the bus arrivals, which might be an enhancement to ridership? Is that something that's been discussed?
Yeah, PACE is looking at and has been looking at putting like what they do in CTA bus shelters, the scrolling, announcements of when bus arrival is. I can get information about when that's going to roll out or when they're planning on doing more with that.
From feedback I've heard, I think that might be a way to enhance ridership because some people just stand on the side and wait for a long time. So I'm glad they're thinking about that.
If you have the Ventra app, though, it also does tell you when the buses are arriving on your mobile device, on the Ventra app.
For PACE?
For all three service boards,
Okay.
yeah, there's countdowns for every route on all three services.
That's good. I don't know if a lot of people know about that, so we probably want to market that more actively because I know a lot of PACE riders I've seen are just standing there waiting and they don't know when the bus is going to come. So
Okay.
it's good to know.
All right, any additional questions or comments? If not,
Question.
oh, okay.
Related to the functionality that Director Lewis was just talking about with waiting times and whatnot, has the board or staff previously studied other expansions to the Venture app that would integrate service from the various service boards? For example, it would function in the way that these rideshare apps function. You could purchase your Metro ticket, and then you'd have the PACE van share pick you up and take you to the next to your final destination. Has that fully integrated approach ever been studied by the board?
Well, I mean, the three service boards, CTA, Metro, and PACE, are fully integrated into the Venture app. So it has sort of real-time information for the arrival of all of those buses. In terms of sort of integration with fares, I mean, you can buy your Metro ticket on it, and it's a virtual ticket on your app. As yet, you can't tap your Ventra, your phone, at a CTA fare reader. And that's not an issue with the Ventra app. That's an issue with the phones not opening up, unlocking basically that access so the reader can read it. So these are things that we're working through, and this is not unique to us. This is a national issue. I was just talking to someone earlier this week in Portland, and they're actually think they're getting close to actually getting that unlocked with sort of the mobile phone, the Apples and the Googles of the world. And be mindful that they're not unlocking them because they want to push everyone to Google Pay and Apple Pay because that's their market profile, right? Or their business model. So in terms of fully integrating, it is something that we continue to work on, look at. I know CTA and all the three operators with the vendor that provides the services on Ventra are constantly kind of working through that and how we can evolve and improve. In terms of being sort of like an Uber where you sort of just drop a pin, and it tells you everything around it. I mean, our data is available out there, and if you did Google Maps, it'll actually tell you, if you hit the little transit bus thing, it'll tell you what all the buses and the trains are around you, and work that into directions just like the car driving directions do. So we have found that us trying to necessarily always try to create that extra level of technology isn't the best space for the public sector to be in, and the private sector typically does it better and cheaper than we do. So we've really taken, of late, the last few years, our approach of our data being open and accessible so they can develop APIs and other tools that they want to use to make that information available to people. It's sort of in a roundabout way of, yes, we are looking at it and continue to look at it, but it's all not fully integrated yet.
It seems to me that's kind of the holy grail of what we ought to try to achieve here. At the board, we're losing ridership consistently on the bus-based methods of transportation, and in my opinion, that's primarily because we don't have that streamlined, easy interface that the private sector competitors do for that mode of communication. If we can have somebody buy their Metro ticket, it'll tell them that they got to connect with this bus, and then that'll get them the rest of the way to the work in one seamless way that really, I think, would probably go a long way to solve our ridership problem on buses.
I think you're segueing perfectly into, so hold that thought into the strategic plan discussion that we're going to have in a little bit. I think these are some of the issues actually we wanted to kind of get some feedback from you on, where's our best efforts put to advance some of these things.
Okay, any further questions or comments? If not, the next item of business is the presentation of the 2015 Peer Performance Measures Report. And who is going to be talking about that?
I'm going to do that, Director.
All right.
Karen Allen was going to do it. She had a unexpected family issue come up, so I will try to deliver this report. Good morning. This morning I will present the regional and sub-regional peer reviews for 2015. Sorry about that. Okay. Last month I presented some quarterly performance results through year-end 2016, so I should take a moment to explain that the FTA requires transit operators to report a few statistics such as ridership, vehicle miles and hours, and safety incidents on a monthly basis. Those data are not audited and can be changed at any time. The measures reported within the peer reviews being presented today also come from the FTA's National Transit Database, or NTD. But they are more extensive and have went through a final data verification process over the course of the summer of 2016 and were finalized and released in November. The reports that I'm presenting today are the second half of the performance measure reports prepared each year. The first set included the regional report card and the sub-regional report card. Those were completed and presented to you in the fall. Those reports focused on our own service boards and contained analysis and discussion of 1- and 5-year trends. I can prepare those reports a bit earlier because of the data is directly received from our service boards via the Performance Measures Task Force. The peer reviews focus on how the Chicago service boards perform in comparison to their peers. So instead of looking at the actual numerical outcomes, we focus here on how we rank in relation to comparable regions and transit operators and see how those rankings change year over year. This is the 9th time we are presenting the regional peer review, which covers the top 10 largest metropolitan regions in the U.S., with Chicago being the 3rd largest. This report pulls together data from the main transit providers from each region. So for the Chicago region, we have aggregated the data for CTA, Metro, and PACE, but other regions may have more providers, such as Los Angeles with 12 or as few as 1 provider, as is the case in Boston and Houston. Altogether, the performance of 42 transit agencies is included in this report. The sub-regional peer review is being presented for the 7th time. This report examines performance for each mode separately: urban and suburban bus, heavy and commuter rail, van pool, and ADA paratransit. For this report, we've chosen 5 peers to compare against the Chicago operator for each mode. Within the regional peer review, we use a 1 to 10 ranking system, with 1 being the most favorable position for having the best performance for a particular metric. In a nutshell, what we see with the regional peer review is that the Chicago region had strong performance overall. We ranked in the top half for 14 of 16 measures and in the top 3 for 8 of them. Chicago does not rank in the bottom 3 for any of the measures contained within this report. We saw 7 ranked positions change in 2015, improvement for 3 measures, and 4 ranked position declines. I'll point those out as I go through the presentation. Both reports use 4 categories for evaluating performance. Coverage describes how much service we provide to customers and how much is actually used. Efficiency and effectiveness evaluates the level of resources spent on delivering and use of the service. Maintenance and capital investment refers to the allocation of capital funds to replace and maintain infrastructure components. And solvency measures refer to financial condition and the ability to meet operational and capital needs. This and the next 3 slides are a series of charts for each of those 4 performance categories. These charts provide the ranked performance from 1 to 10 for each measure, with 1 being the most favorable and 10 being the least favorable. Chicago's performance is highlighted by an orange box so you can easily see where Chicago ranks in relation to its peers. Here you can see strong performance for Chicago relative to its peers in the service coverage category, with each result in the top half. For each of the 5 measures shown here, Chicago's ranking has remained unchanged since 2011. As you can see, New York ranks highest for each service coverage measure. 8 of the regions, including Chicago, reported ridership declines in 2015. Chicago's decline of 0.3% was the lowest decline of that group. Despite the ridership decline, the Chicago region's annual passenger miles traveled still exceeded 4 billion for the 5th consecutive year. That's only happened 6 times since 1991.
Bless you.
In contrast, the New York region's passenger mile traveled is about 18.5 billion, so there's a pretty big gap between first and second place. The next category is service efficiency and effectiveness, where again we see some strong performance from the Chicago operators. The increase in Chicago's operating costs was held to 2%, better than the average increase of 3.3%. The upward green arrow reflects a favorable rank movement up 1 position from last year, which resulted from several factors: a lower operating cost increase than most peers, and an increase in vehicle revenue miles, and slight increase in average vehicle capacity. Chicago retains 6th place for operating cost per passenger trip. It's been at that spot now for 5 years. In 2015, 9 of the regions had an unfavorable increase for this measure, but Chicago's rate of increase was roughly half of the peer average increase. Most notably, Chicago retained its 1st place position for operating cost per passenger mile for the 5th consecutive year. An operating cost of 61 cents per passenger mile is 2 cents higher than 2014 and roughly 25% less than the peer average. This metric is reflective of operating cost containment, as well as the fact that our passengers take trips that are on average 20% longer than the peer average trips. The third category of service is maintenance and capital investment. There were 2 rank changes for the Chicago region, as shown by the arrows. The first measure is for the percent of vehicles beyond the FTA recommended minimal useful life, and that's rail cars for 25 years, buses 12 years, and cars and vans 4 years. Chicago ranked 9th for this measure as recently as 2011, and we got up to 4th place last year but lost some ground in 2015. Movement is of course related to vehicle replacements, but also due to aging of fleets. An interesting thing to note here is that our percentage of vehicles beyond useful life when we were in 9th place, 4th, and now 6th was at 28% in each case. What caused the Chicago region rank change for 2015 was upward movement by Atlanta and DC. This is one measure where we can see a lot of movement in rank position each year over year because you see large orders of bus and rail cars as capital money is used to achieve economies of scale. I'm pleased to report that the Chicago region has reclaimed the top-ranked position for miles between major mechanical failures. We had been up there 2009 to 2012 and then lost some ground in 2013 and 14. That's when we fell to 4th rank as the polar vortex provided us with some service challenges. In 2015, Chicago experienced a 33% improvement for this metric, which means our vehicles have the most reliable performance in comparison to our peer regions. Probably the most notable thing here is that Chicago service operators never shut down completely in the worst weather. We've seen that in other regions, so getting to 1st rank for this metric shows a strong achievement. The final slide for the regional peer review shows service level solvency. The service area in which we saw 1 measure go up in rank position and 3 measures go down in rank positions in 2015. Again, the Chicago region performed somewhat favorably in comparison to its peers and remained in the top 5 for each measure. Chicago actually saw 5 cents higher average fare, or fare revenue per passenger trip, in 2015. While our rank went down, there's only 1 penny difference between Chicago and New York. Chicago again swapped places with Philadelphia and gained 1 rank position for fare recovery ratio. The difference between the 2 is half of a percentage point, and even less of a difference between Boston and Chicago. Chicago lost 1 rank position for each capital program expenditures per resident to 5th place, as Washington, D.C. moved up 2 spots with large outlays for Phase 2 of its new Silver Line, which is the largest expansion of its system history. Of course, New York continues to outspend all peer regions in total capital dollars and per capita. They've got the largest system and have had to invest hundreds of millions of dollars to repair damage from Superstorm Sandy in October 2012. Now we will move on to the second part of the report, the sub-regional peer review. The sub-regional report focuses on each mode by itself: bus, rail, van pool, and demand response ADA. The purpose of this narrowed focus is because there are no industry standards for these measures, so comparisons to a set of similar peers help to establish benchmarks for performance. The sub-regional report allows us to see strengths and weaknesses of each mode and allows us to see unique characteristics or circumstances that may constrain performance or point to potential areas for improvement. These pictures illustrate one unique characteristic of Chicago Transit. Metra operates in a very complicated environment that shares track with freight. CTA has a unique operating environment in that it has to navigate the very tight curves in its elevated loop tracks. This forces CTA to use much smaller cars than its peers, which have up to 2.5 times larger capacity and allows them to have increased service effectiveness. These are things to keep in mind as we look at relative peer performance, because even though our rankings may be worse in some cases, these may not necessarily be things within our control to change. In some cases, our performance is better year after year, but we may not see these changes reflected in the peer rank positions. Overall, we see strong performance in efficiency and effectiveness measures across modes, and we've seen this in prior years as well. CTA Bus continues to be a strong performer, ranking first or second for 6 out of 11 measures. CTA Bus has kept its top ranking for operating cost per vehicle hour for 7 years in a row, and the top fare recovery ratio for 6 years in a row. CTA Bus has 2 areas where it doesn't meet or beat the peer average. That's for miles between major mechanical failures and capital expenditures per resident. CTA has been actively working to modernize its fleet, acquiring nearly 400 buses since 2011 and completing the midlife overhaul of over 1,000 buses in 2015. CTA Rail outperforms its peers for 5 out of 11 measures. CTA had the top ranking for two service efficiency and effective measures: operating cost per vehicle revenue hour and operating cost per passenger mile. It also ranked 5th for maintenance and capital investment measures, miles between major mechanical failures, and for the 5th consecutive year in average age. CTA has had the youngest rail fleet for 2 years running, which is quite an achievement, as it had the oldest fleet among its peers as recently as 2012. CTA has added over 700 new rail cars into its active fleet over the past 5 years. CTA Rail does not meet the peer average for any of the fare-related performance measures. All of its peers raised fares in either 2014 or 2015, and CTA has not had a fare increase since 2013. Metra met or beat its peer average in 6 of 11 measures, including ranking first or second for both measures of coverage and 2 measures of efficiency and effectiveness. Metra maintained its top ranking for passenger trips per vehicle revenue hour for the 2nd year, a measure of service effectiveness. Metra's average fleet has ranked either 5th or 6th since peer reporting began. This is being addressed via Metra's fleet modernization plan, which includes the last of the electric district vehicles being put into service in 2016, and fare set-asides for more capital investment, which include rolling stock purchases. We've been reporting on peer performance for 7 years now, and for each year, Pace Bus has held first place ranking for operating cost per vehicle revenue hour, a measure of cost efficiency. Pace also performs well for the reliability measure miles between major mechanical failures, ranking 2nd or 3rd over the past 5 years despite ranking 4th for average fleet age. Pace is challenged in that it covers a huge geographic region, which is more than triple the size of its next to largest peer. This constrains performance in the coverage area, where we talk about trips per hour and per mile, as well as in the fare recovery ratio when we look at fare relative to cost. Pace's van pool strength also lies in its low operating cost per vehicle revenue hour, ranking first or second for this measure for each of the past 7 years. The Pace van pool program performance is significantly impacted compared to its peers by the lack of HOV lanes and the prevalence of reduced fare ADA van pools, which comprise over half of its fleet. However, these van pools are critical to the Chicago region because they reduce the dependency on high-cost ADA paratransit trips. ADA paratransit service in the Chicago region continues to rank well among its peers, meeting or beating the peer average for 9 of the 10 measures. ADA shows strong overall performance, has a young fleet, and strong fare recovery ratio. ADA's biggest challenge is reliability, as shown by miles between major mechanical failures, for which it has ranked 5th or 6th years in a row. To sum up the regional performance, Chicago performed well in comparison to its peers, ranking in the top half for 14 or 16 measures and no rankings in the bottom 3 for any of the measures. The Chicago operators show particularly strong performance in the measures of service efficiency and effectiveness. The capital program continues to present challenges. This chart shows capital program expenditures on a per area resident basis. As you can see, the Chicago region is in the middle of the pack, but with a considerably lower expenditure rate compared to peers in New York, DC, Los Angeles, and Boston. Last month, you were presented with the updated capital needs report, which spelled out the region's asset conditions as well as the projected needs to bring the system to a state of good repair. Next steps in this performance measurement area include the conclusion of our customer satisfaction survey. At this time, our contractor is working with the data collected, and we will start to prepare reports this spring and come back to you hopefully in early summer. And we will continue to meet with the Performance Measures Task Force to collect and prepare data for the 2016 Regional Report Card and Sub-Regional Report, which we will present to you in September. The full reports were presented to you in your board packet, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Are there any questions or comments?
I have a question. On the miles between major technical failures measure, where we performed number 1, it's obviously a great metric. Have we done anything to celebrate that or acknowledge the, service our employees? How are we using that positive information?
I might defer to Chairman Dillard to respond to that.
Well, number 1 tomorrow, I believe, is Mass Transit Employee Appreciation Day, where literally we encourage our riders who see their conductor generally every day, especially if you're a Metro rider, you sort of bond with these people. You may not know, who they really are, but tomorrow is just kind of pat a Mass Transit employee on the back. The Sun-Times, the day after I wrote it, gave a letter to the editor that I wrote the day before yesterday, a half page with a pretty big banner headline. And one of the things I pointed out proudly is, we have the lowest operating cost per mile of any major mass transit system in America. But we also have, contrary to popular belief, the fewest mechanical breakdowns of any major system in America. And I also pointed out that, and I woke up to it today shaving to the news this morning, that Metro's on-time performance was now 97% in the last month, which breaks the goals. And there is no better system for reliability in America than the Chicagoland mass transit system. And I always point out that we have Chicago weather, which makes it more challenging than virtually any other city in America. And also, we have, at least on Metro, as these statistics show us, we have an aging fleet on Metro. And I pointed out that older cars, while they are absolutely safe, and we had this discussion last month here, while older cars never go out unsafe, our system is safe. Leanne can report about her trip with Nadine to view underwriters at Lloyd's of London. It gets more expensive. And do you know anyone else that's out there that is operating a vehicle that was delivered under the Eisenhower administration? I didn't see many of them driving around, I don't see many 1950 cars riding around Chicago. We're not Havana, Cuba, or Chicago. But I try to point out, Ryan, Director Higgins, that these statistics all the time, but crying for a need. You see what our peers are doing. It's glaring me in the face that New York and Washington, Los Angeles, Boston, these are economic competitors to Chicago, spend much more per capita on maintaining their system. So tomorrow, my hat's off to the mechanics that we have who keep our vehicles, especially Metra, who has old equipment, running very well. So any chance you get, and that includes any of you. You're all directors appointed by certain regions of the state. So whether it's JD down in Joliet, you all have regional newspapers, and you can certainly write as your representative of certain areas, but from where your appointing authority appoints you to point out these statistics and sort of break some of the myths that are out there. The CTA, the mayor will I think tell anyone that listens. The CTA hasn't had, for better or for worse, but the mayor's proud of the fact that the CTA hasn't had a fare increase in 8 years. So the stories are pretty good, but you've always got to look behind and look forward and know that if the state of Illinois, which hasn't had a capital plan since 2009, and last month we talked extensively that 70% of all mass transit referendums nationally passed. Other cities, especially Los Angeles and Seattle and some of these other cities, really know the importance of mass transit in making their economy grow, especially with a millennial workforce that is going to be half of the nation's workforce soon. So, I try to tout it every chance I get. I'll talk about another letter that the Wall Street Journal published of mine within the last week later on about where is Illinois' gas tax. It's in the bottom 10% or bottom 10 in America in terms of what our gas tax, what percentage or what part goes to infrastructure. I mean, we're supposed to be the transportation capital of America, and our gas tax in our state is the lowest 10 in the United States of America. And we clearly know that it's more expensive to maintain some of these Eisenhower-era cars. Plus, our riders scream out for 21st century, whether it's Wi-Fi service or an ability to plug in your personal device or air conditioning. They call for 21st century. If you want to improve our ridership, they call for 21st century equipment. And, let alone, and Jeremy can report later, we know there are much more environmentally efficient engines that are out there. Every day when I walk through Union Station, I can see a little bit of residual haze from the engines, to be very polite, that are there. And we have the state of Illinois has $100 million sitting there in a settlement from the Volkswagen settlement that is supposed to be used for environmental improvement, and hopefully we'll get some new engines for Metra that will be environmentally more efficient than the ones we have. So I pound this home every day. It's very hard sometimes to get attention. One newspaper in this city only wants to report bad news. They clearly do not like to report good news. Let's put it that way. I mean, it's very clear to me. They don't want any good news. They only want bad news. But there's a good news story here. But I live in the real world, and our job is to plan for the future. We have the strategic planning piece of this meeting today, where we've got to be thinking 10 and 20 years out for our region. So I do encourage all of you, write a letter to the editor, to your local papers, and tell the good news story, but always preface it with, every other state's got a capital plan, and once they get their operating budget done in Springfield, we got to have a capital plan here, or we will not have those strong service numbers that our mechanics and employees provide to the riders that are out there. So the story's very good, but there's some caveats that got to be made too. So thanks for letting me vent.
Mr. Chairman and Executive Director Redden, I've never received a more perfect answer to a question in any meeting that I've ever attended, and a card for the public who are here that I can thank my Metro worker tomorrow, so thank you for that.
Director Frega?
I just got a couple of comments here. Metro had a fare increase this year, and the complaints I hear about not the expenditure of money upgrading the system. I think we have to do a better job, as the chairman says, of talking up the system and the expenditures that we make. Metro is got, you know, a very reliable service, but their equipment is antiquated, and that's the complaints I hear anyway.
You know, and I give Metro credit for the first time since I got here. They have a long-range plan. They hit a little bump in the road because they thought there was probably going to be a state capital plan by now, but there's not. But hopefully Metro, and I know Suzanne or Susan Massal works constantly with Metro on their messaging to their riders to let them know where the fare increase is going, how it's spent. And I encourage anybody that rides Metro to talk to their representatives in Springfield to say, hey, once the operating budget is complete in Springfield, you got to get a capital plan, and it's got to include mass transit money as it should.
Director Frege, I think it's important to note too that all of Metro's fare increase is going to capital. And they've been very vocal about that, but I think people forget that.
And I have a question maybe for Jill here. Safety is a pretty important factor in any system, yet I notice none of these criteria deal with physical safety of passengers. And I wonder, I know that New York and Philadelphia and I think D.C. recently had terribly tragic, fatal crashes. Chicago, knock on wood, has avoided that in the last few years. I wonder if there's any way to measure relative safety in terms of injuries or fatalities, though those statistics even exist, or whether that would even be useful. 'Cause I think Chicago system would rate very well.
Yeah, that's a good point. Let me look into that and get back to you.
And their service boards do actually have very robust safety measures. The National Transit Database is the mechanism that tracks our region's operations against even the peers. The performance metrics were meant to be sort of more performance-based, but there is still a lot of robust data, and we can point you in the direction of a lot of that safety data too.
Yeah,
That
and I
data
say
is
that
linked
'cause
on ShyTap.
I think we would rate very highly on that relative to these other regions.
If you take a look at our transparency portal, that data is specifically linked.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments?
So you just returned, both of you, Leanne and Nadine, from London on the procurement of insurance. When you're there, do underwriters at Lloyd's ever ask you or comment about how we do versus other systems, or do they probably not want to tell us that we're better compared to the rest when they're sitting there pricing our insurance? Would you, I know it's on our portal, why don't you pull together something, Nadine, and get it to the board? And Metro can help. I think Director Colson and I we're interested in the entire system, but I'd clearly like to see Metro just because of aging of equipment and other things.
Oh yeah, I'm happy to do that. They actually compliment us quite a bit on, in particular, and I'd love to have Metro actually come and do the presentation here that they've done during the budget season, and when we do those presentations to the underwriters, they do a very thorough presentation on how we keep the fleet as modernized as we can for its age. It's amazing what those engineers are able to do with those cars that are 50, 60, 70 years old. It's really unbelievable. And they have a full video that shows, like, beginning to end, taking the entire thing apart and how they do their daily inspections, and it's really quite remarkable.
You know, and I think I know that in these statistics that Jill just read off, rail cars age. I think the useful life age generally is 25 years. We're certainly over that for a lot of our equipment. But just an anecdotal one, Leanne and I and Jeremy were in Springfield, I think it was last year, and there's a member of the legislature who is a manufacturer's representative who does a lot of work in the transportation industry. And I remember Mr. Orsino was testifying, and he was talking about the age of the equipment, and the state representative could not believe that we had any rail cars in service that were over 25 years. He goes, that's just basically physically impossible. And Mr. Orsino walked him through, our aging, and he's been in here and talked about it, our garage where we repair and rebuild these rail cars. Sometimes the rail cars are sent out for rebuilding. But this gentleman who actually did this for a living was just astonished that we could keep these cars rolling like we do safely and as comfortably and then at the end, the thing I picked up on, and he goes, and you folks from the RTA in Chicago, because he was from downstate Illinois, ought to be really commended and rewarded for keeping this equipment out there so long. So hopefully we'll be given one of these. Our mechanics will be given one of these cards, and hopefully the money will follow.
Director
Just
DeWitt.
anecdotally, my wife and I were on one of the newly refurbished Metra cars within the last couple of weeks. I was amazed at the quality of the finishes, the new seats, the drink holders, outlets at almost every aisle. I literally had to ask the conductor on the way out, is this a new car or is this a refurbished car, knowing that most of them had been refurbished. So it really is an attractive transition that they're able to perform in maintaining these cars within the system. I was awestruck. It was really well done.
All right, any other comments or questions? If not, thank you, Joe. And I would note that Director Melvin is here, so I think we can go back and pick up item number 2, which is the approval of minutes from the meetings held on December 15th, 2016 and February 16th, 2017. Are there any questions or comments regarding those minutes? And then I will entertain a motion and a second to approve the minutes as submitted. Moved by Director Melvin, seconded by Director DeWitt. Will the secretary call the roll?
Director Colson?
Yes.
Director DeWitt?
Yes.
Director Lewis?
Yes.
Director Melvin?
Yes.
Director Troiani? Yes. We have quorum of 5 present and 3 absent.
All right, thank you. So we move to item 4A. There are 3 ordinances authorizing the execution of federal funding allocation agreements with Northwestern Indiana and Southeastern Wisconsin. The second one is amending the 2017-2021 capital program, and the third is the extension of ICE-funded projects. Who is presenting today?
Dave Spacek,
Dave,
the manager of our capital program, will present this to you.
Thank you, Jill. Good morning, Mr. Chairman of the board. I'll try to read and push the slide at the same time, see if I can multitask or not, how this works out. Today I will be presenting the background information associated with 3 ordinances presented for board approval. The first ordinance is for approval of the annual allocation of federal formula transit funds to the region. I guess B's going to help me out here.
Yeah, I'm going to help him out.
Which is good. I'll help I can get. The first ordinance is for approval of the annual allocation of federal formula transit funds in the region. The second ordinance is for approval of the first quarter amendment to the 2017-2021 capital program adopted by the board in December of 2016. And the third ordinance is for the approval of a 12-month extension for 9 ICE projects. As we reported to you a year ago, Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act, the FAST Act, signed into law by President Obama on December 4, 2015, authorized surface transportation program funding for 5 fiscal years through September 30th, 2020. Under the Act, Congress authorized national transit funding for 5 years at $61.1 billion, with annual authorization increases each year from federal fiscal year 2016 to federal fiscal year 2020. The annual authorization sets a transit funding cap, and Congress each year can appropriate an amount up to that cap. In addition, each year Congress can appropriate a full year of funding or break it up into partial funding segments. For federal fiscal year 2017, Congress is elected to only authorize a partial appropriation through April 28th. The partial amount of federal formula funds appropriated to the region is $300.46 million. From the capital program's funding revenue perspective, we anticipate at this time that the full year appropriation will be close to the amount approved in the 2017-2021 business plan. So currently, there's no additional new federal formula funding being added to the capital program. However, as a federal requirement, each year we must amend our letter of understanding with the Indiana and Wisconsin metropolitan planning organizations to reflect the percentage and amount of annual appropriation of federal formula funds to be split to the region. This will be showed in the next slide. The RTA region is split into two urbanized areas, or UZAs, as reflected in the slide. Chicago, Illinois/Indiana UZA and the Chicago, Illinois/Wisconsin UZA, with non-Illinois areas represented by Northwestern Indiana Regional Planning Commission, or NERPC, and the Southeastern Wisconsin Regional Planning Commission, or SEWER-PAC, respectively. As a federal designated recipient, the RTA suballocates the federal formula funds to Northeastern Illinois, Northwestern Indiana, and Southeastern Wisconsin, and capital funds subsequently to the service boards. In 2017, $300.46 million of total federal formula funds appropriated to the region so far. The RTA's portion is $284.84 million, while Northwestern Indiana received $15.5 million and Southeast Wisconsin $120,000. The figures represent the FFY 2017 partial federal appropriation total and allocation of the three applicable capital federal formula funding programs, those being the Section 5307/5340, 5337, and 5339, and the Section 5310 Enhanced Mobility of Seniors and Individual Disabilities Program. These programs are all administered by the Federal Transit Administration. As mentioned, the funding distribution among the three geographical areas for the life of the FAST Act is formalized in letters of understanding, we refer to them as LOUs, with the annual attachments to the LOUs specifying the allocation for each year. The LOUs were officially approved by the board in April of 2016. The first ordinance before you today is to approve the annual split of the partial federal fiscal year 2017 federal formula funds and the LOU annual attachments. The reason this partial split is being brought to the board for approval before the full year appropriation is approved by Congress is that the service boards need to apply for these funds as soon as possible to move ahead on several of their projects. After approval of this ordinance by the RTA Board of Directors, the RTA will provide written notification to the FTA of the apportioned allocation received by Illinois and Wisconsin MPOs, the Illinois and Wisconsin MPOs, and the service boards. This portion of my presentation will give you an overview of the funding and project changes requested by the service boards to be amended into the 2017-2021 capital program and provide the basis for the attached capital program amendment and second ordinance to be approved by the board. As you can see from the chart, the total change in dollars going into the 2017 capital program is $15.97 million. This is due to a change in two funding categories that are part of this amendment: federal and service board and local funds. The change in federal funding is a result of reprogrammed CTA federal funds from previous year's programs to the Red Line extension and the award to CTA of two federal discretionary grants. The change in service board and local funds is the result of a CTA insurance settlement and City of Chicago zoning bonus income funds, as well as PACE's use of positive budget variance funds for capital. In addition, there is no funding change in the out years of the program requested at this time. This slide takes the capital funding increase one step further and breaks it down by service board. The result, as shown, is a $13.12 million amendment being requested by CTA and a $2.85 million amendment being requested by PACE. Metra did not request any amendment changes at this time. CTA's funding change of $13.12 million is comprised of $6.46 million in federal funds and $6.65 million of service board and local funds. The $6.46 million federal funding change is the result of reprogramming $4.98 million of Section 5307 funds from their MMIS Enterprise Asset System project to the Red Line Extension project, a $400,000 federal discretionary public transportation innovation grant, and a $1.08 million federal discretionary safety research and demonstration grant. The $6.65 million service board and local funding change is comprised of $2.46 million, comprised of a $2.46 million insurance settlement, $370,000 in CTA funds to match the new federal discretionary grants, $5.82 million from the City of Chicago zoning bonus funds, and a $2 million reduction of CTA funds to match their federal Tiger grant. PACE's funding change is a result of programming $2.85 million in positive budget variance funds for capital. I will now review how this funding change will impact the capital program from the project perspective by service board. CTA program changes. For the CTA, the $13.12 million change in federal and service board and local funds will go to fund the following projects when you take into account a $2 million reduction of local funds to match their federal Tiger grant. $1 million for the overhaul of 2,600 Sears rail cars as part of a multi-year overhaul project being performed by CTA Force Account employees. $6.44 million for continued planning and preliminary engineering work associated with the Red Line Extension project. $5.82 million for sandblasting and painting of the Ravenswood Loop connector track structure, and $1.85 million for CTA's control center safety and Ventra enhancements. Next slide. PACE program change. For PACE, their $2.67 million change in positive budget variance funds will be added to the $1.95 million of previously programmed positive budget variance funds to complete the $4.62 million needed in total funding to construct the Plainfield Park and Ride lot. This work is part of PACE's I-55 Express bus service, Route 755 and 855, to improve commute options between the Plainfield area, UIC Medical District, and downtown Chicago. Next. The third ordinance before the board for approval is for a 12-month extension for 9 innovation, coordination, and enhancement, or ICE projects. 5 are for CTA and 4 are for Metra. The extensions are needed for a variety of reasons, and RTA staff has reviewed these requests and found them reasonable and necessary. Be happy to answer any questions regarding any of these ordinance requests.
Okay, thank you. And I think your presentation probably set the record for the use of the most acronyms, and so that's quite a distinction. Are there any questions or comments? All right, if not, is there a motion and a second? We can take the 3 items together if there are no questions or comments. Is there a motion and a second to approve these 3 items as submitted? Moved by Director Lewis, seconded by Director Troiani. Leave for the last unanimous roll call.
5 ayes and 3 absent.
All right, good. If there are no further business to come before the public session of the Finance Committee, I will entertain a motion and a second to adjourn. Moved by Director DeWitt, seconded by Director Troiani. All those in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Then we stand adjourned.